Welcome to lecture 16 of week 4 of BHU SWAN course titled Aspects of Cultural Studies. I am Dr. Dhriti Ray Dalai, Professor, Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University, the co-instructor of this course along with Professor P. Dalai. The present lecture is an exploration of the field of cultural studies as it engages with the possibility of including species to an existing list of identity categories like class, race, gender, sexuality, and disability. It will also highlight the contentious and compelling debates that are afflicting this field of animal studies pertaining to the question of the animal. There are a few questions which trouble. For example, what are the similarities and differences between the human and the non-human animal? Whether humans are not animals themselves? Can there be an ethical treatment of animals? If we have to extend sympathy, ethics to the animal species, is it necessary for them to possess language and rationality? These are some of the areas that this lecture will try to cover. Let us now go into the first slide. The first slide talks about the various ways and occasions when there is a human-animal interface. So where do humans interact with animals? The general public is aware of animals who have either religious, cultural, culinary, economic, or personal significance. For example, chickens, goats, pigs, sheep are good to eat for the non-vegetarians. Horses, bullocks, camels can be considered useful. They are good for traction and transportation. Those of us seeking companionship through animals often identify cats and dogs and even exotic pets like pythons these days. So the point that I'm trying to establish here is that beyond these main categories of concern, animals as a generality is not all that pertinent to human lives. Now, when we come to the apologists for zoos, you will find that they talk about the necessity of having zoos because they help in advancing scientific knowledge and also save endangered species from extinction. When we come to the community of scientists and zoologists, we find them engaged in a scientific study of animals. They also identify a kingdom of Animalia, which would comprise of all invertebrates, vertebrates. The lay consciousness is therefore confined to grasping animals, whether they are as friends or they are of some use. What we notice is a kind of a binary established between the human and the animal. When we look at the categorization, we can fall back on the various dictionaries offering us definitions of the animal, and it is situated as a binary to the human. Be it Collins or the Cambridge Dictionary or Merriam-Webster, we all notice that the animal is defined as a living creature other than a human being. That is, not a human. So, animals are homogenized into a singular concept. Derrida takes issue with this, and in his seminal text, The Animal That Therefore I Am, he denounces this phrase, that is the animal, as a catch-all concept used to designate every living thing that is held not to be human. He critiques Western tradition and the philosophers mainly, who have traditionally written about animals in reductionist and essentialist terms. Thomas Hobbes locates animals in the state of nature and therefore outside the purview of the social contract. Descartes cannot even ascribe feelings to animals. This leads us to speculate about a term given by Peter Singer in his Animal Liberation, and it is the term which identifies a form of discrimination that goes largely unnoticed. Discrimination against the non-human species. So how does Singer define speciesism? It is a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. This is also referred to as anthropocentrism. He, in fact, likens it to racism and sexism because there is prejudicial treatment, there is injustice, and there is underrepresentation and misrepresentation of these groups of people. We are all familiar with terms like homicide, suicide, regicide, but I'm pretty sure that you may not have heard of the next term that I'm going to introduce as part of this animal studies lecture. This term has been coined by Piers Bairn. The name of his book is on the screen. And this is theriocide. So how do we go about defining theriocide? It is the killing of a non-human animal by a human being. There are diverse human actions that can cause the deaths of animals. It can involve active maltreatment or passive neglect. It can happen on a one-to-one individual level, or it can be initiated on a mass scale as well by large-scale social institutions. You will also be stunned into stupefaction when you will realize that there are so many various ways of committing this act of theriocide. How do humans go about killing animals? And it can range from boiling, cooking, crushing, electrocuting, ensnaring, harpooning, hooking, injecting with chemicals, poisons, spearing, etc., etc. Therefore, we need to identify certain sites of theriocide, sites that are present all around us, near us, but we oftentimes may not pay attention to the amount of cruelty inflicted upon the non-human animals. So where does this encounter take place? It could be from hunting, from fishing. There are ways that language helps us to camouflage this deceit of ours. We, those who consume meat, believe that we are not eating the animal, we are eating the flesh of the animal. Therefore, it could be pork or it could be ham, but it is not a pig. There is vivisection at the top of the slide. Tom Regan, again a very, very important name in the field of animal studies, opines that worldwide the number of animals imprisoned in research labs must run into hundreds of millions. And what is vivisection? Vivisection is the scientific experimentation on live animals. They are not even dead, but they are still alive when the scientist is experimenting on it. There is militarism from the Nazis to the contemporary times in the battlefields of, the war between Ukraine and Russia. You will come across canine help being used. There is climate change, there is pollution. So these are just random selection of few sites of theriocide. So what animal rights activists pledge against, they protest against, the ways in which non-human animals are kept and slaughtered for food, used in scientific research and experimentation, hunted, haunted, killed for human pleasure, and caged for generations in horrendous enclosures. Animal liberation is that one significant and earliest works on the question of animal rights, ethics, and protectionism. And Singer investigates this tradition of inflicting cruelty and suffering to animals in the Western world, from factory production to animal experiments to eating animal flesh as well. What are the other significant points that he makes in animal liberation? He obviously is tracing the human attitude, from the Judaic to the Greek, to the Enlightenment and the post-Darwinian thought. But most significantly, he talks about animals being sentient beings. What is that? It means that they are capable of feeling pain, pleasure, they suffer like humans. So this is the moral standing of animals, and it is because of their agency and the capabilities that they share with humans. Now, the work of Singer would later go on to influence someone like Tom Regan. And in Tom Regan's moral and political philosophy, a single unified theory of rights is also postulated. Now, one of the very troubling, difficult questions that Singer raises in animal liberation, and this is where he equates the non-human animal with the disabled population as also the orphan children who would be all relegated to the margins of society. And I'm quoting from the text here. Would the experimenters, those who are working on animals for scientific benefit, would the experimenters be prepared to carry out their experiment on a human orphan? The orphan obviously without the pull of feelings from parents, if that were the only way to save thousands of lives. So what he, in a way, reveals is this unjustifiable form of discrimination on the basis of species membership. He also identifies that there are certain handicaps, and you see how randomly he uses a terminology from disability studies and appropriates it in the animal liberation movement. And for the animal liberation movement, for Singer, it means an expansion of the moral horizons. So what are the issues and the problem areas, according to Peter Singer? The very first problem area is that those who are being marginalized, those who are being oppressed, the non-human animal, they are not in a position to organize themselves and protest. So it is always going to be the human speaking for the non-human. The second problem is that the oppressing group are directly involved in and benefiting from oppression. For example, I have already told you how the meat-eating parties benefit from the oppression of animals. Habits are often very hard to die, and it is thought, it is language which has to be altered, which has to be changed, and it is very difficult to undertake. So how can this situation be redressed? And this is where there is this birth or genesis of animal studies, and there is often the understanding that there is an animal turn in critical theory as well. So who talks about the animal turn? It is Kerry Well who identifies this animal turn in contemporary theory, and she links it with this ethical turn and how the post-structuralist and postmodern decenterings have enabled this displacement of the human for the non-human. You know, Richard Grusin is significant to this turn as well, because in 2015, he talks about the non-human turn as well. Now, the non-human turn is this, decentering of the human in favor of a turn towards and concern for the non-human, not necessarily always to be understood in terms of the animal, but it could be towards technologies, bodies, organic and geophysical systems, etc. So from the 1980s, you find scholars challenging the idea that there is this great chain of being and humans are positioned at the top, and there are lower beings and lower animals who are positioned at a lower rung. So animal studies emerges as this interdisciplinary field, and it runs parallel to the animal rights movement. But even before the formal appearance of animal studies, it was Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School who were drawn to the animal question. Both of them were attempting to interpolate and expand on the Marxian thought, and they were obviously, drawn to the animal question. And they would critique Western thought and show how the Aristotelian and the so-called rational man is very irrational when it comes to his engagement with the non-human animal. You will also note that animal studies' origin is primarily, even though it is an interdisciplinary field, but primarily it is from humanities and social sciences, and they counter the models provided by, say, zoology or biological sciences. Literature also plays a very vital role here within humanities, because literature is best equipped to tell us about the unknown aspects of animals, those aspects that science, economics, politics would rather not say. So, literary animal studies would allow us, that is the human animal, to not only identify possible differences, but also take a measure of the suggestive similarities between the two. There is an attempt to review terminologies, and they question whether such neat categories and distinctions separating the humans from the animals is possible anymore. If you use the term animal, it often means animals other than human beings. So rather, instead, we could approach the species as the human and the non-human animals. And I'm referring to Brett Walker, a cultural and literary animal studies scholar, who establishes the human and the non-human almost existing on the same plane. look around carefully. Look at your fingernails, hair, and incisors. We were not built in the likeness of gods, but in the likeness of the other organisms with whom we share the earth. Much like, Darwin's claim on the origin of species. Others would say that instead of lumping all animal species, save one, into a single category, which reifies human exceptionalism, we would rather prefer to use other animals to refer to non-human species. So what are the objectives of animal studies? Very, very importantly, it is to address the omission, the commission of animals. It is in opposition to animal invisibility and oppression. There is an attempt to investigate cruelty towards animals in the context of various cultures. They try to ask how different religions, philosophical traditions, social traditions have said and written about the animal. But most importantly, they would demonstrate how non-human animals are agents and they contribute in important ways to shaping human lives. So there is an entanglement. Donna Haraway wants us to locate and identify these braided histories of entanglement. Now the next slide is a look at one such close, intimate entanglement that takes place between the human and the non-human, and that is through the phenomena of companionship and humans having pets. So whether a pet is an animal after all, because you will find that in the 18th century, we are talking about England, dogs and cats as pets were often perceived as individuals with personalities, almost questioning the Christian belief that animals had no capacity to feel. In a way, it is a kind of an anthropomorphic understanding of animals where you are giving human characteristics like emotions to non-human entities. There are supporters of this companionship, as you find in Kerry Whale, who defends it on the ground that the pets and their guardians are engaged in reciprocal relationships, that the pet is not a slave. But there are critiques of domestication as well, primarily Deleuze and Guattari, who argue that pethood signals the animal's moral failing and his inability to combat the need to conform to an identity imposed from the outside. Adding on to this debate, we have someone like Martha Nussbaum, who raises a vital question as to whether the animals as pets are leading a fulfilling life or not. Whether there are impediments to their social development and growth. It is in a way a kind of a reaction to the utilitarian perceptions of Singer and Tom Regan. And Nussbaum argues that animals are not just capable of feeling pain or pleasure. They also need socialization. They need access to fellow members of the species. So, this is another way to problematize this relationship, intimate relationship between the pet and the master. Now I bring in Cary Wolfe and his reservations against cultural studies. And, Cary Wolfe tries to take animal studies in a new direction to make it more than another area of socially and ethically, responsive cultural studies. He is appreciative of the fact that because you include species as an identity category within cultural studies, you are being more inclusive. But he's questioning this inclusivity, and he is questioning the involvement of the human when he still continues to believe in the divide between the human and the animal. So this mere pluralization won't do. Highlighting subjectivity and agency is not enough, because it ultimately closes off the human from the animal and reinstates the divide that is between the human and the animal. So the problem with animal studies is that animal studies will always be undertaken by humans, and humans will always try to keep animals under control. So this is why he has issues with cultural studies' approach to animal studies, and it would remain trapped in the very humanism and anthropocentrism it sets out to question. So there is, therefore, an ethical and methodological fissure visible to us. Now, the ethical and methodological problem within animal studies is included in this conflict between the humanists and the post-humanists. Now, some scholars like Carey Wolf, Derrida, Donna Haraway, they would want to do away with this subject-centered ethics which has been inherited from Enlightenment. So they would not talk about rights. Rather, they would question the human schema of knowing the subject. So they are asking us to interrogate the species boundary. They are asking us to rethink ethics. So Derrida, and I'm borrowing heavily from Derrida here, he proposes ways of unsettling this dominant way of knowing and thinking about the animal. And he wants us to deconstruct logocentrism, that is, we have to challenge the idea of human monopoly of language, which then should be followed by phallogocentrism, which is the prejudice that privileges the male, and then to carnophallogocentrism, which leads to carnivorous sacrifice, which is vital to our modernity, and all boiling down to forms of violence towards animals. So there are now suggestions as to how we can liberate the animal from this Western critical tradition. And we can start by analyzing this question of language. Now, the equation in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which privileges man's being, the divine soul, logos, and identifying it as a uniquely human capacity, why don't we reframe the questions, and why don't we ask a different set of questions rather? Is human language the only language? Why would we attempt to teach human language to the non-human animal? How many of us, that is the human animal, can speak gorilla? A question that is asked by Erica Fudge. If we can extract ourselves from these questions, then we may as well ask, what if we could hear animals speak? And obviously, we would not be comfortable with the answers. The only way out of this is if we stop ourselves from trapping ourselves in this linguistic representations. It's almost similar to the turn to the body as a pre-linguistic basis of experience. We have to learn to privilege animal instinct. Now, animal instinct is something which we do not value because it is not, recognized as a form of knowledge, because it is beyond the realm of human classification. So now we come to critical animal studies, where it is a reaction to the hyphenated human-animal studies, and the goals include complete elimination of animal use, oppression, and exploitation, use of direct action tactics, protests, marches, sabotage, all are included or all are in the purview of critical animal studies, be it the finch or the pig or the elephant or the megafauna. And it is critical because it has to happen now. The impact has to be immediately felt by the non-human. It is therefore considered an intellectual and a political movement. So what are the suggestive similarities? We are to move away from establishing the differences and trying to identify the similarities between the humans and the non-humans. And it was Darwin in 1871 who had not only identified animals being capable of reason, but also sympathy, curiosity, love, and memory. He attempts to overcome logocentrism by arguing that touch is a very effective mode of communication and language. He would also talk about the, language of the eye, which is very powerful. The point that I was trying to make on the suggestive similarities, you will find that like humans, you will locate cultural variations within a community of, monkeys in grooming, in courtship behaviors. Mahesh Rangarajan has identified the ability of the lions of Gir to have memory of memories, a cross-generational learning for adaptive benefit. Antonio Damasio, the professor of neuroscience, shows how humans are driven more by feelings than their cognitive brain. So feelings which are there in humans, feelings are also there in animals. From the domain of literature and its engagement with animal studies, you have a voice of J.M. Coetzee, who gives us the notion of the embodied existence, the similarity which is based on the body of the animal and the body of the human. Power acts upon bodies, and they are shaped and controlled by modes of biopower. But most significantly, it is again Derrida who introduces the possibility of seeing similarities through finitude. So it's not rationality, it is not logos, but the vulnerabilities that can assign both the human and the non-human and place them at the same level. So the shared helplessness, the weakness, the inability, the passivity, the vulnerability, and eventually death. The ethics of care, as proposed by Stefan Dolgert, makes us question why to limit care only to humans. And its theory is obviously the theory of interdependence, that none of us are wholly or partially independent of the care of others. Coetzee again talks about the soft species boundary, the boundary between the human and the non-human, and it can be bridged and crossed very easily if you want to, and if you are in possession of something called sympathetic imagination, something that is very much demonstrated in a novel like Disgrace, where David Lurie becomes a dog man, the hyphenated identity of Lurie. These are few laws, and obviously there is this Human Methods of Slaughter Act, but we know legislation has its limitations until and unless there is a cultural overhauling of the idea of the animal. Animal Welfare Act, 28-hour law which requires vehicles transporting animals for slaughter to stop every 28 hours, and we question this as well. And there is obviously Endangered Species Act. Now, there is one particular area which also needs, a kind of critical understanding, and this is the emergence of animality studies as, a movement away from animal studies. And I'm referring to the work of Michael Lundblad, who calls for an end to animal studies and proposes animality studies. Because he says that the former is nothing but a feel-good form of neoliberal anthropocentrism. I bring in Gautam Basu Thakur's observation here as well, that from subjects who know their superiority over animals, we have today become subjects who know their culpability in the systemic exclusions of animals. But has anything altered? The binary remains the same, and the non-human is still relegated to the margin. There has not been significant decentering of the human. So, from liking animals, animal studies focuses on discursive constructions of animality in relation to both humans and non-humans. Now, with this, we come to the end of this lecture. These are the references for your perusal, where you have Peter Singer, you have Erica Fudge, you have Derrida, and Brett Walker. So you can actually look at these scholars and enhance your understanding of animal studies. Thank you.